Agribusiness is one of the most important production sectors in the world. It alone accounts for more than 20% of global GDP, and the same is true in Brazil. In fact, agribusiness is one of the key sectors domestically. It represents almost half of Brazilian exports, and Brazil is the world's second largest exporter in global agribusiness. So, what really defines Brazilian agribusiness, and why is it so important? Agribusiness was not always a major player in Brazilian production. In the mid-20th century, manual labor prevailed. At that time, less than 2% of rural properties had agricultural machinery, and there was hardly any research on soil development or seed improvement. The result was low yield per hectare and, naturally, minimal production insufficient to meet domestic demand during the period of industrialization and population growth. Between 1960 and 1970, a milestone was reached with the creation of Embrapa in 1973, which marked the beginning of an important era for scientific research in agribusiness. To put it in perspective, in 1970, Brazil had only one tractor for every 350 hectares. By 2006, that ratio had improved to one for every 70 hectares, representing a gigantic increase in mechanization and, consequently, in productivity. To give you an idea, the Brazilian beef cattle population in 1970 was minimal. By 1990, it had exceeded 100 million head, and by 2021, the cattle population was greater than the human population in Brazil, with more than 250 million head. When compared to other countries, like the United States, which is the only country that surpasses us in cattle numbers, Brazil is the world's largest exporter. 1/5 of all meat exported worldwide is Brazilian, and because it costs half as much as American meat, it is much more competitive in the market, despite having the same quality. For example, while American meat costs $90 per arroba, Brazilian beef is priced at only $45 per arroba. Following the same logic, agribusiness represents 25% of the national GDP. That is, out of the more than 7 trillion reais circulating in Brazil, 2 trillion are generated by agribusiness. In 2005, Financial Times published an article stating that Brazil is producing farms capable of feeding the world, highlighting still today the remarkable growth of Brazilian agribusiness. Brazil is the world's largest producer of various products, but on the global stage, the spotlight is on soy and meat. Brazilian soy alone accounts for 50% of the world's exports of one of the main grains consumed at over 1 billion tons per year. Brazil is the third largest producer in the world, trailing only the United States and China. However, there's one caveat. Unlike in US agriculture, Brazilian producers are unique in that they use only 50% of their land, because by law, part of each farm must be dedicated to environmental preservation. But in the long run, a question arises. Is it possible for a country to develop when a large part of its land is devoted to agribusiness? In fact, the United States has only 5.7% of its national GDP represented by this sector, and China only 10%, which might lead one to think that developed countries don't focus on agribusiness. However, that isn't entirely true. For example, consider New Zealand, one of the most developed countries in the world. There, agribusiness indeed drives development, as the main practices are based on dairy and timber. They don't have a significant heavy industry presence, or, say, car manufacturing. Cars are simply imported. They literally trade milk for cars, which is a clear example of how a country doesn't necessarily need heavy industry to thrive. Therefore, Brazilian agribusiness is truly one of the most important sectors in the world. It's hard to imagine what would happen if Brazil didn't have it as one of the main engines of its economy. Considering that industry and the service sector, the major components of national GDP, are underperforming economically, without this sector, which increased its share in 2019 and 2020, Brazil's economy would be in a much worse state. The prospects for agribusiness are extremely positive. Its continued growth is expected due to strong harvests and ongoing improvements in productivity. And that is why Brazilian agribusiness is so important.